It's not controversial. We are being led astray intentionally. About a week ago, I asked you, and I told you, what do we have? 11 shows remaining. We have 11 shows remaining, 10 after tonight on this network. We have tried to do history. I think there are many, I know, on our crew, including me, and many in our audience that have learned things on this program, in particular about African American history, that nobody has ever, none of us knew. None of us knew. We asked you a few days ago, in our last 11 shows, if we did a show on history, what would you want? The number one thing was another session with my good friend David Barton, who, by the way, is this the first time we've been on TV since you were on with Jon Stewart?
It may be.
I think it was.
I think
you did a good job. I warned you. I
Thank
said,
you, sir.
You're not going into a friendly place, but you handled him quite nicely. It's kind of hard to...
It was a fun conversation.
Yeah, it's hard to debate the fact when
That's right.
you're sitting across from David Barton. Right. I should have actually called Jon Stewart and said, I warn you. He's a killer. All right, David Barton is the founder and president of Wall Builders. Josh Charles is the co-author of The Original Argument, a translation of the Federalist Papers, and Chris Stewart is the author of 7 Tipping Points That Saved the World. Okay, I want to start, well, I'm going to start with the audience, because you're going to direct this program today. Where do you want to start? Yes, sir.
Hey, Glenn, I sit down in the offices of some great members of Congress and the U.S. Senate, Bachmann, Pence, DeMint, Colonel West, and I ask them, how do we get back to the basics, back to the Constitution? And they say, we got to go back and we got to learn it. And I say, how do we learn the Constitution when some of the own Republicans that we put into office are against the Constitution? So I ask you, who's more dangerous? Is it George Soros and his minions, or is it some of these camouflage Republicans that we put in office and they screw us in our back?
I think the most dangerous of us, and let's talk about this one historically, I think the most dangerous of us is us, because it's our responsibility, is it not?
Congress is a reflection of us. It reflects our lack of knowledge of this. Now, I will say one caveat. ISI, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, did the same kind of thing that NAEP just did with that history study. They took the questions that you have to know to become a citizen if you're an immigrant. If you know nothing about America and start from ground zero, here's what you have to know to be a citizen. They gave that to citizens, and 71% of citizens who live here didn't know enough to become a citizen in the United States. Here's the deal, though. They gave it to elected officials as well. Elected officials scored lower on the test than citizens did.
I believe that.
You know, as an officer of our government, an officer of representing the people, whether they're military officers or congressional leaders or Congress people, they swear an oath to the Constitution. And yet we don't require that they understand the Constitution.
Yeah.
There's a couple congressmen or senators who make a point of carrying a pocket Constitution around with them. And generally, they're ridiculed for that. Oh, isn't that quaint that they, that they're referring to the Constitution?
I used to be that guy. I used to be that guy who used to make fun of people who said, "Oh, gee, we're a republic, not a democracy." I'm like, give it a rest. Yeah. It does make a difference. I used to be the guy who ridiculed people who walked around with a pocket Constitution, because you immediately think pocket protector. You're like, oh. Well, hello, Mr. Geek.
Yeah.
How are you today? But you know what? That's all we have. We were talking on the air. Josh was on the air with me on radio today, and we were talking about, we call it now the good and plenty clause that John Conyers said. I don't remember what he actually...
General welfare clause. Right.
Yeah, the general welfare clause.
Yeah.
And we were at the time saying, what the... I don't even know where that is. Yeah. I don't even know where that doesn't exist. He didn't even know the Constitution. Yeah. When we were talking about the 2,000-page bills, the Federalist Papers, what do they say about basically 2,000-page bills?
Basically, if the law is too complicated for people to understand it, that's a dangerous tipping point for any country, where the people that can't understand it, it's unintelligible even to the people who are writing it, and that's what's happened. We've become an administrative state where the government is so pushing itself in areas where it can't go, where these congressmen, congresswomen can't possibly be experts in the things they're legislating on, so they literally consign that responsibility to experts.
And which Federalist paper is it? Do you remember which one it is?
I honestly forget it. 62.
62.
Yeah.
That says if you can't understand it, if you can't understand the bill,
Yep.
then people can't navigate in their own lives, and you can't do business. Yesterday, we heard the president say to the NBC said to the president, "How can you fix this economy if you can't get people to businesses to open up the purse strings?" And his response was, "Well, we have a lot of complex things going on, like, for instance, ATM machines." ATM machines? That's it? Like it's Rosie the robot out dispensing cash. That's not it. It is in the Federalist paper, number 62. Read it. He says, was that Madison?
That was Madison.
Madison.
Yes.
He says in that, if the law becomes so complex that nobody understands it, business won't be able to do business because they'll be trying to figure out the laws and they won't be able to move forward. It's our fault. We have to study it and hold their feet to the fire. Back in just a second. I'm sorry, I just saw my lovely daughter off to the side who's in town for Father's Day. Hello, Mary. We're back with David Barton, Josh Charles, and Chris Stewart. And I have to tell you, and I've said this I know all week, Chris Stewart is a new friend of mine. I read one of your other books on my vacation, and I called him up. My wife about killed me. I called him up on vacation, and I said, "You, sir, are a genius," and wanted to talk to you about it. This is his new book. It is called The Seven Tipping Points That Saved the World. And would you agree that we are at a tipping point now?
Oh yeah, I absolutely would. And if you called me a genius, I have to mention you're the only person in the world who's ever done that.
Yes.
So, hope I can get a tape of this. But yeah, I think we are at a tipping point. When you look at the the coalition of events that are converging now, and I think that some of the things in our culture that have divided us.
Right.
And I don't think that we can sustain this like we have. Now, I don't think we need to be ignorant. I think there's been times in our past when we went through very, very difficult times, more so than we are now.
Yeah.
But this is a time when we need to come together.
Right.
And
but it's what we had at that time, we don't necessarily have now, or we're at the beginning of it, and that is an understanding that the Constitution was solid, that divine providence, that God was involved, right?
Yeah.
And that's what the question is now. You have a worldview conflict we've never had before. We had a big fight over slavery and abolition, etc. But there was still respect for Constitution, still acknowledgement of God in His hand. Not now. There's a whole different thing. We're now at the point where we're looking at elections as, do I choose saving the economy or saving the Constitution? Let's save the economy. And if we go in that direction, we'll lose everything. We're toast, exactly.
James Wilson was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and when he took the Constitution back to his constituents to get it ratified, he said at the very end of his speech, after admitting the Constitution was not perfect, these men knew it wasn't perfect, he said, "I am bold to assert that it is the best form of government ever offered to the world." And so right now, in terms of solving these problems, there is that lack of boldness.
There's another aspect to it too, and that is when you look at George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, you look at James Madison, you look at Franklin, all these guys who are part of it, they said this thing is a miracle.
Yes.
Yeah.
George Washington said there is no act of providence any greater than what we just had. He told Lafayette this, what we just had in doing this Constitution, you'll find no act of providence greater than what we just had.
Yeah.
And if we dismiss that, Daniel Webster once said about the Constitution, miracles do not cluster. What has happened one time in 6,000 years may never happen again. Hold on to the Constitution. And because we're holding on to a divine miracle, if we lose that, there's no guarantee another miracle will happen like this.
And you know, if
He's bumming me out. I don't know.
And I actually think an extension of that point, it's easy for most of us to look back on our founding fathers or that foundational time and say, yeah, those were miraculous events. The preservation of George Washington's life, the miracle of fog at the East River, just a few miles from here, and then the creating of the Constitution. We can list many things that we look back and say, I'm comfortable calling that a miraculous event. But I think there's a couple questions from that. One is, why did those things take place? Why was it so important that this nation be preserved, created and preserved? And then the second question, I think is a fair question, is why do we not think that that can happen now? If you talked about this being a tipping point, why can't we expect for a miracle to happen now that would preserve us?
I do. Let me ask you, how many people believe, and think of this carefully, believe in the protection of divine providence for our nation?
Yeah.
Truly believe that.
Yeah.
Okay. How many people believe in that you could see in your lifetime true Moses-style miracles?
Yes.
I have news for you. I do.
Yeah.
I do. I have seen the shadows of them, and I believe they're going to happen. I really do.
Yeah.
And I've got a great example of that, I think. You know, in 1980s, I was a young lieutenant pilot in the Air Force, you know, preparing like all the military to fight the Russian horde as they flowed through the Fulda Gap in Germany. And I remember flying with a friend of mine. We're kind of talking as we're in cruise, and him asked me the question, essentially says, do you think we'll ever see the fall of the Berlin Wall? And I remember thinking and very clearly answering him saying, yeah, I think we will, but not in my lifetime. And it was not 18 months later that we sat there with our mouths open and watched that whole thing go away. And if anyone says to you, oh yeah, we saw that coming, I just don't believe it. It's like guys who say, I was at Woodstock. Everyone claims it, but it's not the case. No one saw that coming.
I don't claim that, nor would I ever.
I'm obviously too young. But military intelligence, or intelligence organization, no one predicted that that would happen the way it did in such a short time. And how can you look at that and say, what a miraculous event? And how many people have access to freedom now?
Let me reverse that. How many people do you know that now say, this could never fall apart? You know, could America fall apart? Oh, no, not in my lifetime. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point.
If you don't understand your foundations, it's real easy to fall apart because you don't know what you're defending or protecting.
David, can I put you on the spot? And I've only have 1 minute, so I'm going to break early. And then when we come back, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to tell the story, because this is one of my favorite stories about the Constitutional Convention. And when I think it's the delegates of New York, and they're thinking about cheating. And they're like, hey, come on, can you give us some candy here? Because we got to take it back to New York. And I mean, have you seen the people on Broadway? They get pissy. And so he said, how can we live with ourselves if we don't do the right thing now? And it's one of my favorite phrases of Washington. You know what I'm talking about? One of my favorite phrases of Washington. And I contend that we are the people that he spoke about in that. And we'll go there next.